Fourth one, turn on the microphone. Actually, it says grow in love, same thing. Fifth one, become like children. Today we're going to start with the sixth one. Wait with patience. Wait with patience, Matthew chapter 13, verse 24 to 30. It's a story, it's a parable that Jesus told. We're not quite sure when he told it or how he told it. As you might remember, when the gospel writers like Matthew was putting together this material, much of it, maybe like today's story, much of it had already been circulating. If we were like Matthew's community, we could say and probably find out who had what kind of material. If we were catechists, if I was a catechist, I might say, well, the only thing I have to go on is this little sack of stories they gave me. These are all miracle stories. Somebody else could say, well, that's interesting. I got a whole sack of parables. And I got a whole sack of miracle stories and parables and some other things there and on and on. And if you'd say, well, do you know when Jesus used those? Do you know what was going on when he said them? They'd say, no. Well, you go further. Do you care? Not really. I know how I'm going to use them, and I think they're from him, and so how I'm going to use them is the way I'm going to use them. So when he puts all this material together, he's doing it to give us his own vision. This is what Matthew is doing. He wants us to have his vision of what the good news is all about. When you read Mark, you'll get another version. When you read Luke, another version yet. And when you read John, still another version. And lucky for us, from the very beginning, the church has always insisted, keep all four. Don't latch on just to one, because you need all four based on the different perspective that we have. But the church also says, I don't want you scrunching them together, thinking that if you can some way scrunch all four into one, then you got the full picture, because you don't. You just got a scrunched up mess. Each and every one of these has a life and a vision of its own. And we've been listening this week to pay attention to what Matthew's vision is and the advice that he's given us when your initial mission fails, when it looks like things are not going to work out, when it looks like this has been a big mistake, when it looks like there's no way we're ever going to get out of this. What do? Well, that's what we've been listening to what he says. Here's what you do. One of the things you do is you wait in patience. He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven. And remember, when you're reading and dealing with parables, the subject matter of a parable is always one of two things, or sometimes two of two things. Always it's about kingdom of heaven or about God. In each case, Jesus would tell us the same thing. You think you know a lot about God. And we would say, we do know a lot about God. We've got millions of books written on God. You know, there's hardly anything you can tell us about God that we don't know. To which Jesus would smile and say, well, you don't know very much about God, really. And what little you do know is probably wrong. And then he would go on and tell us, and it's the same thing with the kingdom of God. You just think you know, but you don't. To which then we might say, okay then, what is it? Glad you asked. Here it is. The kingdom of God may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came, sowed weeds among the wheat, then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? He answered, An enemy has done this. The slave said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he replied, No. For in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time, I will tell the reapers, collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. Wheat, weeds, we might not use that terminology, but we certainly use the concept. We know who the weeds are, don't we? They're people who aren't like us. They're weedy, they're weeds. And we know about the wheat. And we also know that wheat and weeds are not supposed to be together. Sometime if you want to find something interesting, go to your Google and type in weeds. See what happens. There's a lot of stuff there about weeds. Where I live, right outside our main recreation room, we have what is called a rock garden. It's really not a garden of rocks. It's got stuff in it, flowers of some kind or other. I don't know much about flowers. The guy who took care of that for years, a guy named Brother Flavian, I'd get in there every once in a while, and I'd say, Flavian, this really looks nice, this yellow thing over here. And he'd look at me like I had two heads. That's a weed. Well, it looks nice. What do you mean? No, it's a weed. It doesn't look nice. It's got this nice yellow flower on there. What do you? It's a weed. Get over it. A weed. And then it's gone. No weed. What makes a thing a weed and what makes things wheat? Bad, good. We make that judgment all the time, don't we? Even though we might not use the terminology of wheat and weeds, we use the terminology of people. There are certain people we have already judged are suitable, are good. And there are people that we know are not suitable and not good. And we're not hesitant to make that judgment. And we think that the people that are not suitable should not be here. We are more inclined to be exclusive than inclusive, which puts us in direct odds with Jesus, who tends to be always inclusive and not exclusive. That's one of his positions that probably upsets his religious officials the most. He doesn't keep track of the weeds. And then when he does, he's got this really strange attitude. Rather than look at something and judge it already in its earliest days as a weed, maybe if you just let it grow, along with what you call weeds, maybe it could change. Maybe what you are now calling weeds, if you're patient enough and wait enough, maybe the inner dynamic between wheat and weeds would be such that next time you look, you would notice that the weeds seem to be a little more like the wheat. And maybe if you just let it grow to the end, you couldn't tell any difference. But you see, to let that happen, you got to be patient and willing to let them both go together. You don't want to clear them out too soon. You don't want to weed your garden too soon, because you'll pull up some of whatever the other flower or weed might be. And then toward the end of the story, remember, he makes it very emphatic. I'm going to have you, when we do the harvesting, put the good things in one sack and the bad things in another sack. And then he says, I will make the judgment. I will make the judgment regarding the wheat and the weeds. You don't make that judgment. See, that's part of the teaching. We don't make that judgment. That judgment is not ours to make. Although you and I know that's what we do all the time. We have felt we are entitled to make that judgment because we know, don't we? What else you need to know? We know the good from the bad. The good like us, the bad not like us. Easy. Get the riffraff out, and that would leave the best, wouldn't it? Yes, people just like us. Jesus would find that to be unacceptable. And he goes out of his way to show how unacceptable that is. Remember what he does in healings oftentimes? Nobody ever disputed, in the Gospels anyway, nobody ever disputed Jesus having the ability to do cures. And you'll notice that his religious officials are always with him, looking around to see what he's going to do. And as soon as he knows that, he bends over backwards to upset them. You notice what he does. It'll be a Sabbath. And the Sabbath has certain rules that you observe. On the Sabbath, you do not do certain things, and other things you're permitted to do. You can't do anything that's considered work, unless it's a matter of life and death. And if it's a matter of life and death, you can do whatever you need to do to keep the life. But if it's not a matter of life and death, then you don't have to do it. You shouldn't do it. So Jesus will wait, and he'll see these Pharisees looking at him, waiting to see. Be Sabbath. And he's a very pious Jew, Jesus is. He's always hanging around the synagogue, and he always attends Sabbath service. So he's not some left-wing renegade, trying to tear things down. He's very observant. And there's a couple of those stories, where he sees this guy. He's inside the temple on the Sabbath, and he's looking at this guy, and he's got a shriveled hand. And the Pharisees would have said, nobody dies from a shriveled hand. You don't have to fix that right now. You could wait until tomorrow when the Sabbath is over and then do all the fixing you want. Jesus would say, well, here, let me ask you a question. Can you do good or do bad, do evil on the Sabbath? Well, that's a no-brainer. You always do good on the Sabbath. But the question is going to be how you determine what is good and what is bad. Then he called that guy with the withered arm, and he knows everybody's looking at him. Stick out your arm. And poor guy probably doesn't know what's going to happen to him either, but out it goes. Next thing you know, it's healed. And the opponents of Jesus, the Pharisees, go berserk. What on earth are you doing? Well, I'm fixing something that's broke. You can't do that on the Sabbath. I just did. Well, you shouldn't. I should. You never have limitations on doing good. There are no laws that are valid that say you cannot do good today. There are no people that you cannot do good for on any day. regardless of what the Torah, the laws, the stipulations, any of that sort of thing. That's the way Jesus operates. That's the way Jesus operates. And he also is very hesitant about the wheat and the weeds. It's not our call. Patience. Because it's not going to change overnight. And when we learn, if we could ever get to the position of agreeing to live together in some kind of semblance of humanity, then we might discover that after a while, learning how to live together produces a good bit of good. It brings out good in us, and we discover it also brings out good in others. And when you've got two goods working together, you really have something that's important. But you have to wait, and wait for it to grow. And in the process of growing, weeds can be very irritating. Even flowers that are going to end up nice in the beginning can look bad. But if you can be patient enough, the growth process will work. And then toward the end, we might discover, well, there's not a whole lot of difference here. Or better yet, we'll discover I'm a better piece of wheat than I ever would have been because I have spent a lot of time with these weeds. Weeds might have a function other than being an irritant. We might want to think about that because there are plenty of wheat and weeds here. I don't have any list, but I would suspect if this is like where I live, in the monastery, we gather together in prayer 5 times a day. I'm on one side and other people on the other, and we're looking, weeds. Where are the weeds this morning? I guess they're sleeping in. Yeah. That's what happens when you're a weed, Lament your losses. Number 7, chapter 23, verse 37. This is a little short story. It's not a story, a little short vignette. People don't spend a lot of time on it. It's Jesus lamenting over Jerusalem, chapter 23, verses 37. And of course, we heard when we went through the Beatitudes about blessed are those who mourn. Well, Jesus is right in line with that attitude again. He's taking that understanding and he's applying it over here, but the gospel writer Matthew is showing Jesus doing the mourning, the lamenting. And for Matthew, the piece of advice is lament your losses. Here's what Jesus was saying. Yeah, the scenario is Jesus is outside of Jerusalem, and he's looking at it, and he knows what's going to happen. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you, desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Now, there's some interesting questions related to that lament. When Matthew's gospel was written, say around the year 80 or 85, there was no temple. Temple was destroyed in the year 70. The temple, both temples, remember, Solomon had a temple built that was a magnificent piece of work. hugely expensive. The people really didn't want a temple. Remember, David had already told God that he thought it was about time God get a decent place to live. That God, up until that point, had been hanging out in what was called the Ark of the Covenant, which didn't look very dramatic. It looked like just a square box on wheels that you could just wheel with you everywhere you went. And so when the Israelites would go into war, they'd wheel the presence of God in with them, and that would pretty much guarantee their success. But they were done with war now, and David was older. He said, you know, it's about time you upgrade here. This is not a good, decent way for any God to live. I'll build you a house. You can find this story in the second book of Samuel, chapter 7. I'll build you a nice house. How's that? And he's talking to his prophet. His prophet is a guy named Nathan. And, you know, Nathan, he's not going to argue. It's not his job. So, well, that's what you want to do. Okay. But then God comes to Nathan, says, that house idea, forget it. I don't want it. I like being mobile. I like moving around. You can build it if you want, but I won't live in it. So let's just get that clear. I don't need it. I don't want it. You don't need to have it. To which David said, okay, fine. Solomon didn't ask. Solomon, the son of David, just came along and he built it. It cost a fortune. There were 12 tribes. It cost one tribe an entire year's income to support that temple for 1 month. After that temple was built, and it was built with almost slave labor, but they were Israelites, and broke everybody practically. But you discovered one time Jeremiah the prophet came along, and he stood there on the temple steps, this magnificent temple, this temple that was going to be the house of God forever, totally indestructible because it had in it the Holy of Holies, which was supposed to be the place where God resided. Nothing would ever, ever hurt that temple. And then in 586, the Babylonians came, destroyed the whole thing. But before that, the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 7, magnificent chapter, was standing on the steps of that temple, and he was telling his own people, like me standing here in this church, and I would start telling you know this church? Well, enjoy it because it's going down. Yeah, it was built nice. I think, yeah, it's great, good, looks good and all that. But the reason that it was built, the motive behind it, and the expectation of what would be the results has been a total failure. Now that was blasphemy according to Jewish Torah. And Jeremiah could have, and some would have said, should have been killed for talking like that. The interesting thing is, he was right. That which was never going to happen, happened. The temple was destroyed. Eventually it was rebuilt. And when it was rebuilt, the idea was, there was a few prophets who talked about this, you have to have a temple because you got to have a place where God can be found, and therefore we have to build the temple. So they put together this kind of wooden shack. People who had seen Solomon's temple and later saw what this wooden shack looked like, it says in the Bible, they just sat down and wept. It was the poorest excuse for a building they'd ever seen. It was King Herod who came along and took this shack and totally revised it. King Herod was a terrible person, but he was a good builder. He knew how to build things. He was always time building this magnificent temple. Again, the same attitude. Finally, the house of God has been constructed. It will be here forever. And then remember that scene toward the end of the ministry of Jesus? We find this same scene in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus enters Jerusalem. The Jerusalem he just wept over in this little passage we read. He goes into Jerusalem and he goes into the temple. And it's the high holy days, meaning the temple is packed to the bone. And he starts taking what would normally be considered good. People buying and selling animals for sacrifice. Well, an animal had to have no blemishes. So the only place you could really get a good, decent animal like that was buying it there, and it was a good service. You had to pay your temple tax. They wouldn't take secular money, but that's all right. We got ATMs. Here, you give us your money in the secular realm, we'll give you the other kind of money, and you can pay your tax. Good stuff. We're happy they got it. We're all for it. It's in the outer courtyard. That's permissible. And Jesus comes in, all of a sudden goes berserk. He knocks the tables over, and he starts talking about making my house, my Father's house, a den of prayer, a den of robbers, thieves, all of that. That's blasphemy. That's the exact same thing Jeremiah did. Now, many people think the reason Jesus did that is because he's upset to the commercialism in the temple. You shouldn't be buying and selling in the temple. He could care less. He's not against the commercialism in the temple. He's against the temple. Same attitude. The very reason this temple was built has never been fulfilled. The temple has become nothing more than an empty building. And God is not pleased, and it's going to come down. That's why they killed Jesus, because of that attitude. And he said it out loud, and then he did that prophetic action. He acted it out. And the result was the Jewish leaders who saw him knew it was blasphemy, and they said, that's penable, you can punish that by death. Roman soldiers who saw that said, he's a dangerous person because he's going to cause a riot, and the bloodshed will be terrible. He's got to go. So you put those two together, and it was decided that he is a danger to the state, an insurrectionist, and it was ultimately the Romans who killed him. Lamenting over your loss. Matthew puts this scenario before all this other stuff that's going to eventually ungo. But Jesus has that sense. It's just about to go anyway. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who were sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you are not willing. See, your house is left to what is desolate. What is desolate? Lamenting your losses. We need to learn from this because, remember, this is advice Matthew is giving us in our day. And maybe we have to, you hear this when people talk about the church and how difficult things can get in the church and how sometimes it looks like might not make it. We don't know what's going on and all of that. People will pipe up, oh, that's all right. The church has been around for 1,000, 2,000 years. I guess you're supposed to hear that and say, well, I guess we're home free. It's been around 2,000 years. Now what? Well, the implication is, oh, it'll be around another 2,000 years. The danger of that is that's exactly what those who went before us said of those temples. Before Jeremiah, they said that of Solomon's temple. It will be here forever. Nobody can destroy it. Wrong. Wrong. It was destroyed. The second temple, the one Herod built, same attitude. Finally, we have the temple. We can have the presence of God. It'll never go. Wrong. It did. Maybe it's not a good idea to say to ourselves today, well, you know, the church has been around 2,000 years. It'll be around forever. Nothing can destroy the church. That we have that attitude to get us off the hook. If it's going to be here for 2,000 years, no matter what, why should I worry? You know, it'll be this way, then it'll be that way, but it'll always be here. Jesus would say that's a dangerous way of thinking. Those who have thought that way before have been seriously wrong. Lament your losses. Some would say, it's interesting, Jesus being the Son of God, do you suppose if he really wanted to, rather than lament the loss of the temple and the city of Jerusalem, he could have done something to fix it? Well, maybe. We don't know. Maybe he could have. What we do know is he didn't. So it's a mute question. Maybe he could, maybe he didn't. And it went down the tubes. Lament your losses. Another one, number 8. Lead by serving. Chapter 20 in Matthew, verses 24 to 28. This is kind of an interesting little story. It is interesting if I can find it. It comes at this third passion prediction in Matthew's gospel. There are 3 passion predictions where Jesus talks about what's going to happen. And the disciples generally have not understood. Jesus will say something, about the future. Oh, here's what's going to happen to me. I'm going to be arrested and all that, and crucified and died, but I'll be raised up on the 3rd day. And they don't understand what that is. They misunderstand it, so he has to come back and give them a corrective teaching. Here's what I meant when I said that. He does that 3 times, and he picks that up in Mark's gospel. But here's the 3rd time. Now notice this opening, which is kind of interesting. Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling before him, she asked a favor of him. Now that doesn't sound so strange to most people, but this same story is found in Mark's gospel, chapter 8. Chapter 10. And it's the 2 brothers themselves who come. And in Mark's gospel, this is to show you how selfish and how they don't understand Jesus at all. So they come to him and they ask for positions of honor. Give us positions of honor, one at your right and one at your left. Matthew doesn't like that. He doesn't like putting those disciples in such a bad situation and a bad place. So Matthew has their mother come and ask. Historians would say Mark probably has it right. Matthew has modified it to make these 2 guys look a little bit better than they were. And he said to her, "What do you want?" She said to him, "Declare that these 2 sons of mine will sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your kingdom." Well, the irony here is, what those positions are on his right and on his left. It's not going to be in the kingdom, it's going to be on crosses. That's really not what they're asking for. They're not quite sure what they're asking for. But Jesus answered, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am about to drink?" They said to him, "We are able." Don't believe it. He said to them, "You will indeed drink my cup, but to sit at my right hand or at my left, this is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." When the 10 heard this, now remember, these only 2 disciples went up and their mother asked Jesus for this 2 places of honor. When the other 10, heard it, they were angry with the two brothers. Now there's debate over what the anger is about. Some say they're angry that the other two brothers got what they wanted. They asked and they got. Now what about us, the 10? Why don't we get anything? Others say no, it was inappropriate. They're angry at those two guys because they shouldn't have done that. I think they're angry because they think James and John got what they wanted. We didn't get anything. But Jesus called them. Now here's the corrective teaching. Jesus called them to him, and he said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. It will not be so among you. And here's his teaching. But whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant. Doulos, servant. Slave, you can also translate that word. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. It's an interesting kind of warning here at the end about just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. That phrase, that saying there is found, interestingly enough, in the ordination ritual of a deacon and a priest. So while you're dressed up all there in your finery in the sanctuary and the bishop is getting ready to lay hands on you and all that sort of stuff, the scriptures kind of stand out here and say, this is okay for today to look all dressed up and glorious, but remember, your real function here is not to be served, but to serve. Where I live, we had an archbishop once who loved ordinations. He got excited. He was a heavy guy, but he didn't like anything better than ordaining deacons and priests. And, he was very positive about all of that, and everybody liked him. But he'd get nervous. And he'd get down there to that place where he's supposed to look at these guys out there who are about to be ordained and to remind them, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and he would get those words mixed up. That the Son of Man came to be served, not to serve. Well, everybody's head jumps up. And, well, okay, I have chosen the right path. And then at the end, you would call him in after the service was over and say, Archbishop, one little thing here. And then you'd point, he'd go to peace. I didn't. Well, you did. We'll help you next time. Okay, next time, same thing. The point that he's trying to make here, and what's going on in Matthew's community, see, the reason Matthew's pointing this out about serving and being served, and that what a disciple is somebody who gives one's life for the kingdom of God. Serving. That's what we to do. We're serving. To be last, not to be first. Something that we don't hear about in our culture. Our culture is always about how to be big, how to be first, how to get everything you need. Let the other guy figure it out for himself. That's not what it's supposed to be. We are to be followers of Jesus in terms of his service. And remember, his service was giving everything for the kingdom of heaven. Apparently, in Matthew's community, he's got some leaders who are not doing well. He's got some leaders who are more interested in self-service than in offering service to others. And so he's trying to point that out, that this is not the way it is supposed to go. You lead not by domination. You lead not by the accumulation of power, because that sort of attitude, remember, is the fundamental attitude of the kingdom of Caesar. Caesar's kingdom says, I promise you peace through domination. And we'll have to be a little violent, but that's how it has to be. If you want us to make you safe, then we have to go out there and do what needs to be done. And we'll get rid of the people we don't want, we'll bring in the people we do, so on and so forth. And Jesus is absolutely opposed to that. That is not what the kingdom of heaven is about. The kingdom of heaven is about a collection of followers of Jesus who are intent on serving one another. On serving one another. That's what discipleship is all about. That's how you lead. The best leaders are those who serve the best. Those who serve the best. And we know when we look at leadership in all kinds, not just church, but all kinds of leadership, the ones that are most successful are the ones who are most interested in doing what needs to be done for the people that they are serving. Lead by serving. There's two more left for tomorrow. We're going to look at those. The ending of Matthew's gospel will be one, go out to all the nations. That's going to be important, because all through this gospel, if you've been reading it or had read it, you would be familiar with, quite often Jesus will say, I have come only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I've said that before. And we know that in the beginning that was his mission. He wasn't interested in Gentiles or any of that other Samaritans. He had a very strictly focused mission. That's all going to get turned upside down in this last thing about go out to all the nations. It's going to be his last words to his disciples after he has been raised up from the dead. It's interesting sometime to go through the gospel and try to figure out, why did he change his mind? When did he change his mind? I have a theory on that. I think he changed his mind when that Canaanite woman beat him at his own game. I think that's when you're going to start to see he was realizing that maybe this is going to be a little different than he thought. But anyway, that's for tomorrow. And then the last one will be choose life. Advice from an evangelist on how to deal with a community that is in distress. Now, nowhere will Matthew tell us these 10 points will bring you instant success. What he wants us to understand is, looking at these 10 points, if we can begin to put them into practice, then we have the opportunity to change. But remember, for Matthew, the key factor is always put it into practice. If you don't do that, don't expect any changes. The old definition of being crazy, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. That's called crazy. And that's the way we oftentimes operate, you know. So, advice for a community in distress. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. Somewhere. There's cars here. Okay.